Today it is our huge privilege to be speaking with Professor Scott Sunquist. Professor Sunquist is Dean and Professor at the School of Intercultural Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. A highly prolific author, Professor Sunquist served as the editor for A Dictionary of Asian Christianity, which was released in 2001, along with David Wu Chu Sing, and is also the author of the text that we'll be discussing today, Explorations in Asian Christianity, History, Theology, and Mission. Professor Sunquist, we're really delighted to be speaking with you today.
Great to be here. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Professor Sunquist, your text, Explorations in Asian Christianity, is a collection of essays that is written over the course of 15 years. You've been researching this topic for a good while. This particular text is divided into 4 sections. We have firstly an introduction to Asian Christianity, and then sections on history, missiology, and education. What led you to orient your academic research career to the study of Asian Christianity?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. It's not something you would expect, being somebody from the Midwest originally, but we were in a Bible study in Charlottesville, Virginia in the 1970s and feeling guilty because we were studying the Bible every week but not really doing anything. So we began to ask the question, is the Christian life just about sitting around and studying the book? And we came at a conviction one Advent about the identity of the Messiah as being one who cares for those who are lost, those who are hungry, those who are naked, and said there must be something we could do. And there was a magazine on the table that said they needed, World Relief needed sponsors for Vietnamese refugees. So to make a long story short, in 2 months, we invited a widow and her 4 children to live in our house with us. We had a daughter who was 6 months old. We were 24, 25 years old. And for the next year of our life, we thought about all things Asian. And as a result of that, we started studying a lot about Asia, about, not just Vietnam, but these were people who were refugees in Malaysia. And then when we had a clear sense of call to mission, we turned away from Latin America because we thought we could learn Spanish. It's a lot easier to learn than Chinese or Vietnamese. And the whole preparation in grad school for mission work ended up being in East Asia.
Very good. Professor Sunquist, the study of world Christianity generally has changed massively since you began working in the field. What are some of the research techniques that are perhaps newly emerged or emerging that you find very promising for the study of future Christianity in Asia?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I studied church history, it was pretty much doctrinal history that I studied. And so we took a look at the Lutherans, how they developed, the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, Reformed churches, and so forth. And when we began studying the history of the world Christian movement, Dale Irvin and myself, we brought on board sociologists and anthropologists because as Christianity goes from different cultures, it's always contextualized. Jonathan Edwards was dealing with his local context. He wasn't just a systematic theologian sitting in a small city in Massachusetts. So all theology is contextual. So we began to study more of the local context. And so when you write about world Christianity, you have to start by talking about local religions and beliefs to understand why, for example, does Korean Christianity and a lot of Chinese Christianity look evangelical to fundamentalist? Well, that's our misperception. It really is Confucianist. And so you have to understand a little bit about Confucianism to understand how Christianity develops in East Asian areas. So that has just been huge. So when I teach historiography, we focus a lot on how it is we understand local family systems and local religions and religious beliefs and politics in order to understand the development of Christianity in different areas.
Professor Sunquist, in Chapter 3 of your book, you provide a fascinating portrait of ecumenism among Asian churches. How is ecumenism in the Asian context perhaps different than we've witnessed the ecumenism of the European context in the 20th century to be?
It's not even close to similar because in Asia, ecumenism often was forced upon the church by the Japanese Empire or by the British Empire or something, whereas in the West, it's sort of by choice. In Christendom, everybody is some type of a Christian, and so you're trying to get along. But in East and South Asia, for example, even in West Asia, Christians are minority. And so you're struggling to find your identity. And when we lived in Singapore, the different denominations and even Catholics got along very well, and even Hindus got along with the Christians because they were struggling against a government which was trying to restrict religious belief. And in Malaysia, the same thing. You have a dominant, Islamic country, And so you're brought together out of necessity. You have to cooperate. The biggest impetus to unity in Asia really came with the Japanese Empire, because they forced churches to unite, and we don't have anything like that in the West.
Professor Sunquist, I understand that you teach world Christian history and also a historiographical section within that context.
Right.
Why is it perhaps that when we look to the history of Christianity in another context, we can quite clearly see the interrelation between politics and religious life, but when we look to our own context, it's very, very difficult for us to sort those issues out?
Well, it's probably a little bit like the fish in the tank. You know, he doesn't realize that he's wet. Just everything is wet. And the same is true. Let me give it another example. When I was in Singapore, it was so obvious to me that Chinese were very racist about Indians and Malays. They were less concerned about that or less clear about that because that's just the way they were raised. There's a sense of superiority of the Chinese who've migrated down and have very good businesses. And so it's very obvious to them. Well, my understanding of racism in the United States was just heightened when I came back and realized that I had not seen the kind of racism in our churches in the United States. The way that I describe it is Christianity is by necessity intercultural, multicultural. It gains its health and its new vitality by crossing barriers into other cultures. And when it does that, then it begins to see itself better. It has to reinterpret itself. It has to be retranslated. And with every retranslation, it becomes recentered. And so the vitality that comes from migration, from mission work, is not just helpful or sometimes difficult, but I would say it's a necessity for the health of Christianity.
Professor Sunquist, I wonder if you could comment and perhaps give us a reading recommendation. In your comments there, I detect an affinity with pieces like Andrew Wall's The Ephesian Moment or Daryl Guter's Missional Church. Do you have preferred reading assignments that you give your students to help us understand exactly that concept you articulated?
Yeah, I think, well, I would encourage this book now because it's built a lot on those ideas, and it did come out of, I know those people. I've worked very closely with Daryl Guter. We were in a covenant group together, so we shared a lot of ideas. He's been very helpful, and Andrew Walls also was a part of our history project. So we share a lot of those ideas together. But just to extend it a little bit further, I think it's vital for us in the West to understand that our church conflicts and our difficulties in the church really have to do more with contextualization than they have to do with theology. A little thing like why are people leaving our church? Well, it may not be because of our theology. It may be because we've lost contact with our local context. So I'm writing a book right now on a basic guide to the church for those who don't do church. That may not be the title, but the idea is for people who have come into Christianity later in life or had left and now are coming back or planning churches and they weren't Christian at all, to understand what I call the continuity and context that's a part of the church. We have to always be continuous with the cross, with Jesus, with the early church. So I'm very big on the early church developments because those are cultural developments that took place. So I don't just study the early church in Europe, but I look at Syriac-speaking Christianity and Armenian-speaking Christianity in Asia, and then North African Christianity and European Latin-speaking, and see this different cultural context, how Christianity developed differently. So we want to be connected. We don't want to just be free-floating and do our own thing as if the church, didn't have any development. But then we also want to be aware and alert to our local context. And that's where intercultural communications are helpful. When we have migrants coming into our church from other countries, and they say, well, why don't you have all-night prayer meetings once a month? And we say, why should we? Oh, in Africa we do that every month. We call them fire nights and so forth. Well, we're beginning to learn something about our attitude towards prayer.
Professor Sunquist, back to chapter 3 of your text, Explorations in Asian Christianity. What are some of the unique successes and perhaps unique failures that you identify in the context of Asian ecumenism?
Okay, I think some of the great successes were the Church of South India and then later on the Church of North India. And there were, for a period of about 30 years, a lot of unions that took place. Thailand, the Church of Christ in Thailand, Church of Christ in the Philippines, and go on and on. They were great successes. The problem was when they came together, they became sort of static after a while and lost the dynamic that took place as they were different denominations. But at the time, they were great successes because you found, I mean, where else do you find a Presbyterian bishop? Not that there are a few other places, but basically South India, Church of South India with Leslie Newbigin. Well, that's a great that's a great breakthrough that you have sort of this Anglican ecclesial model with Presbyterians involved and even some Methodists. And the Church of Christ in Thailand was a great success too. But the problem is those churches then later on lost a lot of their missional dynamic. And I think this is the tension that we always have in ecumenism, is maintaining our concern for unity for the sake of the missional dynamic. So often it ends up being an end in itself. And when it becomes an end in itself, it loses what I consider the theological dynamic of John 17 and Jesus' high priestly prayer. Because that prayer is the unity for the sake of witness to others. And it's just so easy. I don't know if it's a personality thing or we have a hard time holding two things together. But we have people that work real hard at that unity and then completely let go of that unity is a part of a process, a dynamic that all the nations, that all might believe.
Professor Sunquist, in chapter 12 of your text, Explorations in Asian Christianity, History, Theology, and Mission, you present an introductory theology to the subject of mission and migration. What do you see as some of the major opportunities for world mission that may emerge out of the current refugee crisis that we're witnessing primarily in the European context as they take in Syrian refugees?
Yeah, let me back up just a second and say this about migration. It's only been the last maybe 15 years that we've recognized that migration is not something exceptional today, but it was normative in the way Christianity grows from the very beginning. The early persecutions forced people out, and that migration to the east helped to develop Asian Christianity in Persia. And then there were tribes coming in from Central Asia into Europe. And as they migrated in, they were evangelized slowly. It took about 1,000 years, you know. But they were evangelized. So the way the church grows and develops is dual. We send people out, and then people are sent, you know, into us. And so this is the normal thing. So we take a look at the refugee crisis today in Europe, as well as in Syria and in Lebanon and Jordan. We go on and on. That's sort of normative. It may be more dramatic today because we're aware of it and so forth. But think about the migration in the Reformation. I mean, John Calvin, he didn't stay in Paris. He went to Geneva, and then he's in Strasbourg. And then in Geneva, there are people coming down to study. So there's all this migration and movements of people. We need to embrace this as the normative way that God works in order to both give vitality to the faith, as well as to break open people's hearts and minds to see their new identity in this Christian community wherever they go. So I would say we train people here at Fuller who are moving, you know, into the Middle East, into Europe, to come alongside and find out ways that they can present the gospel, to love people, to care for them. And there have already been tremendous responses. There are huge groups of people. For example, I just heard of some people coming back from Greece, new worshiping communities of Syrians who are all new believers because they've been bombed by Muslims, and then all of a sudden they're loved by Christians, and they put the two together and they realize, you know, God, we lost our homes, we lost everything else, but we found God.
And I'm sure you get this question quite often, Professor Sunquist, but what are some of the practical recommendations that you might give to American congregations who wish to participate in the mission of God through work in the refugee crisis?
Well, of course, you know, that's a question outside my expertise because I'm a historian, but I'll take a stab at it. The first thing that I would tell a congregation is you should have as a part of your prayer every week to be attentive to migrants. You know, we pray for missionaries, but we don't realize that there's two ways, like I just said, two ways that the gospel is spread around the world. There's migrants. So if you have as a part of your liturgy every week to be prayed, to be attentive to migrants, then you will find some people come forward and recognize the people in their neighborhood, and then they'll begin to find connections with and how they can become more directly involved. And some people may actually go somewhere. That's what happened to us. We invited migrants into our home. They lived in our house for a year. And then later on, we ended up going to East Asia. And you'll find that people in your congregation, their hearts change as they begin to learn to love those people that come in that direction. And we also have to get away from this thought that, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to our country? Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen to our country is going to be blessed, because America, most of the people who come to America who move here are Christian. We're not like Europe where most of the people. So we have all these Christians coming, and I live in LA County, and the first language in LA County is Spanish, not English. More people are fluent in Spanish than English. And so, praise God, most of them are Christian when they come here. And that has had a tremendous impact on the whole understanding of society and culture here in LA County. So to embrace this, to understand theologically that migration is a part of God's great design in mission is a whole, I think, turn for people. And so your mission committee is not just preparing people to go out, but it's preparing people to show hospitality.
Thank you for that reflection, Professor Sunquist. We appreciate that. The final section of your text is dedicated to education, and specifically theological education in the context of Asia. And in this section, you present some biographical sketches of some pioneers in this field, including Julia Brown Mateer, Henry Winters Luce, and William Rainey Harper. What are some of the principles that you would like to identify from those biographical sketches that might orient continued endeavors in theological education in Asia today?
Okay. Let me just make a quick prefatory comment. Of those three people, William Rainey Harper was a fascinating genius who got his doctorate by the time he was 18 years old, his PhD. He was a genius. And he's known for being a person who excited a lot of the educational missionaries that went to Asia. He was the first president of the University of Chicago. So he's an academic that a lot of these missionaries, like Henry Luce, look to as guidance for how to teach. And so he is a person back in the States that had a great influence on what happened in Asia. I think the first thing that people should know is we assume that as culture moves along and develops through time, we get smarter. And it's just not true. The earliest missionaries were kind of naive, and they went and they had to study the culture, they had to study the language in order to survive. And so they really studied the language. And so the Mateers, for example, were constantly working at a glossary and a dictionary of Chinese. And Julia developed most all the musical terms for classical music that are used in Chinese. She was out there in the 1850s, and she was a music teacher and a Sunday school teacher. And so she just did what she knew how to do. And so she had to develop terms. And then her husband, Calvin Wilson Mateer, he also was a high school teacher, so he developed terms for physics and chemistry in Chinese. So all those early terms were developed by these Presbyterian missionaries from Western Pennsylvania who didn't have any training in cross-cultural communication or educational theory. They didn't study at University of Chicago or at Harvard or Yale. They just were kind of doing what they knew how to do. And as a result, the school that they started in Shandong province became the first university in China. And it was unbelievable. Well, you skip ahead 2 more generations of missionaries, you end up with somebody like Henry Luce. Henry Luce is the son of the founder of Time Life magazine, a very wealthy family in eastern Pennsylvania and New England. And when he went out, he said, we're doing all this stuff in Chinese, but gosh, there's so much great education in English. We should teach the Chinese to speak English. Then they would learn so much more. Well, see what that shows is a lack of confidence in the local culture, a lack of sensitivity to the local culture. Well, he should have known better. But because of the overwhelming kind of imperialism and colonialism of the West, it's sort of like those people need more of what we have. And what's behind all that is social Darwinism. By the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century, social Darwinism is kicked in. And Westerners, by and large, and I can authenticate this many different ways, by and large really felt that the Christian responsibility was civilizing the natives. And it's language today that sounds, repugnant, but it was the language. And it was sort of like the white man's burden, that we want to help these poor people. How can they learn, algebra if they only know Chinese? And so we have to teach them English. So that was really a move backwards. And that what that creates is by the time we get to the 1920s, a reaction against the West. And in China, there's a very strong reaction against the West in the 1920s. That's the time of the rise of communism in China.
One of the very interesting things of studying mission history is you see what endeavors turned out to be fruitful and which didn't. This is a topic that you also pick up in one way in your book, The Unexpected Christian Century, The Reversal and Transformation of Global Christianity 1900 to 2000, available in 2015. Professor Sunquist, what are some of the dynamics of current mission work that you see in the world today that you anticipate will be extraordinarily fruitful or highly fruitful in the century to come?
Yeah, I would say two things. One is a heightened understanding of how to do partnership well. With globalization of the church and the movements of people and so forth, we don't need to go to set up seminaries in India and so forth. There are some great Christian leaders there, but they desperately appreciate help and support in working in partnership and degrees and that sort of thing. So that's one thing that's going to be very important when it comes to poverty and development, children at risk, urbanization, all these major issues. We should not abdicate our responsibility of coming alongside those people, listening well and seeing how we can help, because we have tremendous experience in education and history in dealing with these things. The second thing I would just say in one word is the Chinese. Christianity in China has really surprised everybody. We can thank two reasons for this. One is the tremendous work of the missionaries early on, and secondly, it's Mao Zedong. Mao's persecution of the church drove the church underground, purified the church, and there was enough good work and Bibles available and so forth. When those people went underground or had to keep their little Bible studies going, the church was vitalized, reinvigorated in very local context. And so then when that pressure was taken off, the church, found itself, and the Christians reconnected with one another. The church grew very rapidly. We never expected that China would not only develop its great openness because of business in the world, but now as they're sending people out to look for oil and cement in Sri Lanka, in Africa, in Latin America, many of the people that are going out with these companies are Christians. And now a lot of church networks in China are actually sending people out as missionaries, either through companies or through migration. It goes back to the 1920s is when first began this movement, the Back to Jerusalem movement, where Chinese Christians appreciated the fact that Christianity first came from Jerusalem or from the West, and so they said, now it's our responsibility to take it back. So what this is going to mean is, what kind of training do these people have? I think that they would benefit greatly from some of the mistakes that we've made in the past, and not to impose too much of the culture. The Koreans, the same thing. They had a very sudden explosion of missionary endeavors in the 60s and 70s, and it took a long time for them to begin to learn sort of appropriate methods and not make a lot of the same mistakes that were made in the past. So those would be two major themes, I think, in the 21st century.
Professor Sunquist, what do you see as some of the greatest opportunities and threats in the context of theological education in Asia today?
Well, I think to build on that earlier statement, one of the greatest opportunities is partnership. And it's going to be to the development of theological education, not just in a Western model where people come to a local center, but also where we build on an age-old concept that's often forgotten, and that's where theological education is sort of by extension or in local context. In the 1850s, there was an article written by John L. Nevius that basically laid the foundation for the three-self principle of mission work. But his basic point was, when we take people out of their context to get theological education, we lose the very thing that they need, and that's the relationship with people in their village or their town. And if they're gone for like 2, 3, 4 years, they get back and they're irrelevant. And so we want to provide the education right where they are. And so in Shandong province, as well as in North Korea and Pyongyang, the basic model was, at the end of planting season and at the end of harvest season, people would come away for 1 month to a center. At that time was Pyongyang, which we don't think of this as a Christian city today, but it was called the New Jerusalem back in the 1890s and early 1900s. It was a hot center of the development of Christianity. So these leaders would come from these villages for a month, and they would learn like the Gospel of Matthew and Exodus, and they get teaching on that, and then how to preach. Then they go back and they would do everything that they were taught in their village. And then they go through and they had planting season, and they'd be tired, and then they come away for another month, and then they would learn Psalms and Romans. And so that it was very biblically based, but they did not leave their context. Everything they learned, they immediately took back. This explains one reason why the church grew so rapidly in North Korea early on, faster than in South Korea. The growth in South Korea was simply, again, migration. The communist takeover, Christians migrated to the South, and so the South became the center of Christianity. So that, I would say, is going to be a central concept that I hope develops even further today.
Professor Sunquist, we really appreciate your reflections. If I can close with a question that we've been asking all of our guests on this program, and that is this: what would it mean for the church today to be united? How would we recognize this unity, and what is it that we can do to pursue the unity of the church today? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that one of the most important things is to push against the dichotomy of unity and mission, and to take a look at it's easy in Asia. The unity is not a theoretical or just a theological thing. It's a very practical thing for your very existence. Only in the Philippines is Christianity a dominant religion. Everywhere else, Christians, in a sense, are guests, or they're persecuted, or they're tolerated, and that's about it. And so unity is not something that's simply theoretical or theological, but it's a necessity for their very survival. And so to build on that, and to build on that unity, which is going to come, I disagree with the concept of being united only in mission, because when we're united in mission, then we have to begin to talk about what we're going to say. And then we're going to find all of a sudden that the particular divisions that we had over baptism, or over Eucharist, or over how to understand relationship to society, those things break down. You don't have to talk to Christians in Malaysia about the importance of having a public witness and speaking up. They know it every day, and they know the struggle that they have. So I think, on the other hand, we can learn from Christians in Asia who've had to live as a minority, often persecuted, and that may prepare us for the kind of unity that we need to have in the West, because we're headed towards more and more marginalization of the faith in the West, I believe.
It's been our delight today to be speaking with Professor Scott Sunquist, professor and dean at the School of Intercultural Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary, author of many books, including the book that we've been discussing today, Explorations in Asian Christianity, History, Theology, and Mission. Professor Sunquist, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much for your time. God bless you.